The wind didn't just howl over the early American frontier. It negotiated, bargained, then slammed the door on its way out, tugging at bonnet strings and muttering something rude about your corn stash. It was cold. Not the poetic, frosted window pane kind of cold, but the sort of chill that made a man reevaluate his relationship with toes, largely because he couldn't feel them anymore. For settlers arriving in 17th century New England, winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a personality test. The trees were tall, the snow was taller, and the welcome committee consisted of frostbite and chronic regret. No guidebook, no weather app, and certainly no heated mattress pad. What they had were axes, livestock, an alarming faith in porridge, and, crucially, cleverness born of desperation. You see, as cozy as a log cabin might look in colonial-themed illustrations, the first shelters were impressive only to raccoons. Many immigrants, fresh from more temperate European climes, expected winter to be a bit nippy. Light cloak, hearty stew, maybe the odd snowball, not 4 months of snow trying to eat your roof. And so, many newcomers were obliged to abandon their architectural dignity and do something both clever and humble: borrow from those who had weathered this land far longer. Indigenous peoples of the Northeast had been practicing thermal pragmatism for generations. Earthen lodges, wigwams, and longhouses, structures adapted to the landscape, huddled low to retain warmth, insulated with bark, moss, and in some cases, sheer brilliance. The settlers observed, took notes, and regrettably, far more, and began to dig. Literally. This is where things take a delightful turn toward the underground, both literally and secretly. When timber ran low or blizzards arrived faster than hammers could swing, some settlers turned to the earth itself for shelter. Hollowing out hillsides, building sod houses, even tucking themselves into ground-level dugouts lined with straw, mud, and maternal hopes. Picture it: a slope near a frozen creek, the entrance half concealed by a snowdrift, and inside, somewhere between a fox den and a hobbit's minimalist studio apartment, a family dozing near a fire pit, bundled in homespun layers, cooking something vaguely turnip-adjacent. No windows, no floorboards, no expectations. Just survival, practiced artfully. Now, these secret survival shelters were never Instagrammable. If anything, they resembled muddy badger dens with better porridge. But they worked. The temperature underground stayed remarkably stable. Fires built low and slow simmered stews and small talk, and the thick walls muffled the kind of wind that could rattle your molars. Some even built straw roofs covered in sod, allowing grass to grow come spring. The shelter was homemade, slightly lopsided, and wildly effective. The real trick, the part no almanac necessarily wrote down, was the insulation material. Straw, animal hides, leftover, thatch, and even dried dung were layered together like a misunderstood lasagna. Mothers swaddled babies in rabbit pelts. Fathers reinforced walls using snow itself, packed tight to create makeshift insulation. And people got creative. There's record of one New Hampshire settler who buried barrels of dried beans around the inside perimeter of a dugout so that, in the event the roof collapsed, at least they'd have dinner ready. Now that's optimism wrapped in legumes. The small details mattered. Keeping a pipe hole for smoke venting, building raised sleeping benches to escape the cold seep of the ground, and placing flat stones upright near the fire to radiate heat like settlers' version of a space heater. All passed from neighbor to neighbor, often described in reverent, slightly frostbitten tones. Of course, people didn't always want others to know they'd resorted to a dugout. There was social shame associated with laying low, quite literally. But those in the know, and those who lived to greet a green spring, knew better. Humility makes a far better shelter than pride. And if you imagine falling asleep in one of these shelters, fire crooning low, the walls humming with muffled snow, perhaps a lullaby from a grandmother who swears by stew and folklore, it's warmer than you might think. If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let your eyelids fall gently now. We're warm, tucked in below the frost line of old secrets and poorer construction codes, in the grey hush of approaching winter, where even the trees seem to brace themselves like elderly men pulling scarves tighter. Early settlers found themselves facing the season with the same level of preparation that one might bring to an unexpected math test. The first snowfall often caught the newcomers charmingly off guard, as if nature had not made her intentions perfectly obvious by turning all the leaves crunchy and scaring off the birds. These settlers, bless their wool-wrapped optimism, soon realized that their old-world instincts were better at planting tulips than battling sub-zero temperatures. The wooden homes many hastily built creaked and leaked, giving the biting wind a helpful little corridor straight to the bone marrow. And so it was that a grand, overlooked hero of survival history slipped quietly into play: the dugout. Now, it must be said, a dugout sounds exactly like what it is: a hole hastily carved into the earth, occasionally enhanced with some planks and dreams. But oh, what a hole it could be. These semi-subterranean shelters were precisely what Mother Nature would have recommended had she dabbled in frontier architecture. Tucked into riverbanks, hillsides, or just plain dug into flat prairie, dugouts offered the one thing above-ground cabins could not: insulation, courtesy of dirt and gravity. They were so good at trapping warmth, one might have imagined they came with complimentary badges and a fireplace made of gossip. Imagine it now, somewhere in the territories of what we now call Nebraska or Kansas, in the waning gold of a late autumn sun. Settlers hitch up the oxen after a long day of not finding firewood and retreat into a humble doorway half swallowed by earth. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of smoke, stew, and wet wool. Basically, the perfume section of a frontier store. The ceilings are low enough to induce humility, the walls packed tight with sod and stubbornness. Yet within these earthen cocoons, winter suddenly seems negotiable. But here's the delicious irony. Settlers didn't invent these clever shelters. Indigenous peoples across North America had long known the power of earth-sheltered homes. Tribes like the Mandan had perfected semi-subterranean lodges long before anyone in buckled shoes thought to reinvent the wheel, or rather, the hole. Their lodges were structured with immense practicality, topped with wooden beams and often covered in sod, creating an organic blend of engineering and environmental wisdom. The Mandan didn't just endure winters, they hosted them like guests at a competent, well-catered dinner party. So when settlers finally took the hint, whether by observation, desperation, or the subtle encouragement of frostbite, they began burrowing, transforming mud into miracle. Sod houses and dugouts became synonymous with what we now glamorize as frontier grit. But at the time, it was less grit and more try not to die. Of course, nobody said a dugout was comfortable. If you've ever lived in a damp root cellar with relatives and livestock who don't respect personal space, you might get the idea. Walls might weep in heavy rains. The occasional snake might drop by unannounced. offering neither affection nor rent. Still, a dugout offered hope, warmth, and sometimes a packet of biscuits, if you'd had the foresight to not eat them all in September. Over time, settlers refined their dugouts into more livable dens. Cow chips, yes those, served as fuel in regions where wood was as rare as a dry pair of socks. Chimneys were constructed from sticks, mud, or even stovepipes salvaged from passing optimism. Windows were made of greased paper, which offered roughly the same clarity as antique jelly. But these humble homes, patched together with practicality and borderline audacity, saved countless lives. And although few survive today, their legacy is embedded in the very soil they once shared with prairie dogs and frozen hopes. It's a curious thought, really, that survival in the harshest of winters sometimes depended not on what stood above the earth, but what sank faithfully beneath it. In a world that exalted progress as vertical, some of the wisest builders looked down, not up, and nestled into those warming hollows beside sputtering fires and the occasional whistling draft. Families told stories about lands they came from, lands they dreamed toward, and the kinds of places where cold couldn't quite reach the soul. Somewhere beyond the smoke, beyond the frost-blown edge of vision, a new trick, or trapdoor, was beginning to take shape. And it wouldn't come with instructions. In the hush-hush stillness before dawn, when even the pine trees seemed to be holding their breath, the settlers began to stir. Not because they were rested. No, their straw pallets were about as comfortable as a sermon on tax laws, but rather because each frosty morning was a polite reminder that winter had opinions, and those opinions were icy, loud, and not particularly negotiable. So how exactly did these early settlers, many of whom had never seen snow deeper than a soup bowl, manage to not freeze like a forgotten wheel of cheese in a root cellar? Cleverness, and a lot of digging. You see, these folks were not about to go toe-to-toe with the wind howling outside like a ghost that skipped breakfast. Instead, they retreated underground, into shelters sometimes called soddies, or even more whimsically, dugouts, which sounds like a cozy baseball snack shack, but was actually more like living in a hobbit's minimalist studio apartment. These weren't complex architectural wonders. Think of it more as dig a small room into the side of a hill, reinforce it with logs, add a roof made from sod, and voila, a naturally insulated hut where the walls didn't talk so much as muffle the blizzards. The genius of the dugout was its sheer simplicity and thermal inertia, a fancy way of saying that Earth is a surprisingly good blanket. It doesn't let go of heat easily, and that was a delightful discovery for settlers whose idea of central heating often involved huddling near whatever didn't burn too quickly. Now, if you're picturing these cozy caverns lit by flickering lanterns and echoing with fireside banter, you're not far off. But spare a thought for the smell. Between wet wool, damp earth, occasionally smoky chimneys, and a diet that leaned heavily on salted pork and later regret, the aroma inside a winter shelter was best described as lived in. It was a perfume that only the desperate or deeply in love could endure. Interestingly, the idea of hiding from the cold by moving underground wasn't something European settlers dreamt up while chewing on frozen biscuits. Indigenous peoples had been perfecting seasonal housing for thousands of years. Structures like the Earth Lodge of the Mandan, or pit houses used across the Arctic and Pacific Northwest. These weren't just shelters, they were bacon savers, civilization enablers, and the product of deep ecological know-how. But, as humans are wont to do, the new arrivals took one look at the ancient designs and said, well, we can probably do that, but with more draft and questionable angles. The result was the settler dugout. Humble, slanted, leaking slightly at the corners, and yet remarkably effective. And lest you get the impression that these homes were only practical and not delightful, consider the curious psychology of cold. When the entire world outside feels like it could bite your ears off, even the plain dirt walls of a well-dug shelter can feel sacred. Children carved drawings into the frozen ground near sleeping mats. Adults strung makeshift curtains from old petticoats and horse blankets. One enthusiastic Iowa family allegedly carpeted their dirt floor with last year's Montgomery Ward catalogues. The definition of luxury is, after all, wonderfully elastic. Now you might be wondering, what about windows? Let's just say, mostly a no. Glass was expensive, rare, and likely to crack at the first sign of a tantrum from Jack Frost. Most dugouts had either a small wooden shutter or no opening at all, which was excellent insulation and terrible for early risers. But what these little homes lacked in daylight, they made up for with resilience. Blizzards could roar and stampede across the prairie like angry poetry. But inside those earthen wombs, families could nap, mend socks, boil beans, and tell each other stories about places where February didn't last until May. There was something calming about being beneath the ground, snug, together, and just a little bit hidden from the growling world above. And hidden they stayed, wrapped in fur and wool and mutual dependence, listening to the long roll of wind tumble past their mounded roofs. As the snow deepened and the light grew ever more blue around the edges, a new challenge crept in, not one of temperature, but of time. Because winter, for all its frozen snarling, had a sneaky way of stretching days and compacting canned goods. Next came the gentle art of passing time and staving off cabin fever, preferably without eating the wallpaper. But that's a tale best told with a cup of something hot and a few more blinks into our growing dream. If you asked a 17th century settler what their biggest winter nightmare was, they might have glanced up from their beaver stew, shivered with dramatic flair, and whispered, "The wind." Not the wolves, not the dark, not even the total absence of little luxuries like fresh fruit or indoor plumbing. It was the wind, that endless bone-cold whisper that climbed into chimneys, slid beneath wooden doors, and danced through the cracks in log walls like it had paid rent and brought its friends. Which is exactly why some settlers stopped trying to fight the cold and instead made a decision that was both brilliantly logical and borderline whimsical. They began burrowing. Yes, like hibernating bears or extremely crafty moles, certain early colonists embraced the earth quite literally and dug themselves cozy little shelters into hillsides, riverbanks, and even the occasional hollow beneath a fallen tree. These were known, perhaps too literally, as dugouts. Now, the dugout was not just a hole with a tarp. Oh no. It was a thoughtful, often artfully constructed wonder of survival architecture. Picture this. You approach a gentle rise along the edge of the prairie. It's quiet, a little frosty. From the outside, you might mistake it for a grassy bump or a particularly confident badger's home. But then, lo and behold, a wooden door creaks open, and in you go. Inside the walls are packed earth. The roof, a patchwork of prairie sod, intricately draped over wooden beams repurposed from wagons, broken barns, and occasionally neighborly bartering. The floor might be trampled dirt or covered in woven grass mats. Or if you're very lucky, a sheet of flattened bark. It smells like mud and pine and boiled rabbit. And my friend, it's warm. This was insulation before insulation had a publicist. You see, earth is a marvelous thing. Once you're a few feet down, the soil maintains a stable temperature, somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Not exactly tropical, but when the wind outside is busy trying to snap your eyelashes off, it feels like the Riviera. Settlers in the Midwest, particularly those tackling the unforgiving sweep of the Great Plains, became masters of this subterranean snugness. Before towns were established, before supplies could be hauled comfortably over from river ports, things like lumber were a luxury. So rather than hauling logs across flatter-than-flower fields, many homesteaders decided to disappear downward. Some got fancy. There are recorded tales of dugouts with shelves, beds, clay ovens, and even curtain dividers, which, while made from burlap sacks, were proudly referred to as interior design. One particularly ambitious settler in Nebraska reportedly built a double dugout duplex joined by a tunnel so he could visit his in-laws without getting frostbite or starting a feud. There's no record of whether he regretted this decision. Children slept tucked into corner nests filled with straw and wool blankets, often sharing with a sibling or three, and the occasional sleepy chicken. Oil lamps flickered against the earthen walls like fireflies in slow motion. There was a peculiar quiet to these spaces. Nothing above, nothing to rattle, just the soft heartbeat of a family trying to outwait winter. Now, were these dugouts always secure? Absolutely not. Rain loved nothing more than to test the engineering limits of a roof made from grass. Mice thought they'd hit the rodent jackpot. And ventilation. Let's just say if you were cooking beans inside a dugout on a cloudy day, proceedings could quickly descend into what one historian called a smoky, musical ordeal. Still, for all their flaws, these shelters were a warm rebellion against the elements, a whispered promise from the earth itself: hide here and you'll make it. Later, some of these diggy dwellings gave way to soddies, sod houses, built above ground, but still cloaked in the insulating magic of prairie turf. But before the walls of sod were raised, before lumber wagons crawled toward prairie towns, there were dugouts, low, humble, and absolutely life-saving. You wouldn't know it now, walking the grassy emptiness, where the wind still whispers like it remembers. But somewhere beneath your feet, a settler may have once snuggled into a pocket of earth, watched the frost creep around the doorframe, and fallen asleep dreaming of spring. And speaking of dreams, next comes the surprising tale of smoke holes, sleeping platforms, and one settler who accidentally invented the heated bench while trying to keep his sourdough starter alive. Somewhere between a blanket of snow and a blanket of silence lies the humble earth lodge, an architectural whisper from the past. Early settlers didn't just brave winters, they outwitted them with shovels, logs, and the occasional borrowed idea from indigenous genius. You, see, while a great many aspiring colonists preferred to build above the frost line and subsequently freeze their buttons off, the clever ones took a somewhat more horizontal approach, directly into the ground. The principle was simple: when the wind bites, drop lower. That, and thick walls. Really thick walls. Imagine for a moment, it's the 1600s. Your breath curls in the air like invisible ribbon. Your fingers are 5 tiny rebellions against frostbite. And your chimney's doing a better job inviting smoke back inside than letting it out. There you are, a settler with big dreams and icy socks, standing in the snow beside a vacant hillside. Watch your move. Dig. Naturally. Thus was born the dugout shelter, known to some as the hobbit holes of historical hardship. Though regrettably less whimsical, they became a fiercely practical form of winter survival. Pioneers carved these shelters straight into hillsides, or, lacking terrain cooperation, shoveled deep into flat ground before roofing the top with logs, grass, and the occasional leftover thatch. Dirt might not sound glamorous, but its insulation properties bordered on miraculous. It's one of the few construction materials that actually improves when ignored. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke, stew steam, and the blunt aroma of survival. Seats were carved from packed earth. Storage shelves were dug into the walls rather than nailed onto them, since nails were often worth more than the shelf's contents. And the beds? Well, let's just say, if you're picturing a goose feather mattress, you've overestimated both geese and luxury. Most folks crammed gently into straw ropes or hay pallets by the hearth, bodies stacked closer than firewood. Not glamorous, but warm. And when Jack Frost went house to house pressing his icy nose to windows, the folks in dirt houses simply didn't offer him an opening. And then, of course, there was the sod house revolution. Settlers on the Great, the plains found themselves with about as many trees as friends at a tax audit, 0. With the prairie wind howling across their shins and no timber to spare, they turned to the only building material that answered back when you stepped on it: grass. But not just any grass. The Great Plains boasted thick-rooted sod that tangled so tightly it could hold shape after cutting. With a bit of back-breaking effort and a very sharp spade, a prairie settler could slice blocks like brownies from a baking sheet, assuming your brownies were made of tangled roots and compacted dirt. These were then stacked, mortared by hope and friction, and sealed with whatever could convince the wind to look elsewhere. What the sod house lacked in aesthetic appeal, it made up for in tenacity. Walls 2 feet thick could shrug off both winter's tantrums and summer's sunstrokes. Plus, the acoustics were excellent for overhearing your neighbors, though, regrettably, you lived with them. Now, to the untrained eye and nose, these shelters may have seemed little more than slightly upgraded animal dens, but within those sunken floors and mossy lids lived stories, births, banjo ballads, hard-won meals, and laughter. Oh, the laughter. There's something undeniably bonding about shivering through a blizzard with 6 people, 1 fireplace, and a raccoon that keeps sneaking in through the roof. Perhaps most endearing were the sleeper designs, the small, clever additions settlers devised as frostproof finishing touches. South-facing doors to catch the low winter sun, half-buried chimneys to safeguard against wind shear, and windows crafted from greased paper when glass was rarer than sleep during childbirth. And yes, greased paper. 1 part wax or animal fat to make it translucent, and 2 parts desperation. It wasn't perfect, but it kept out the snow and let in an impression of light, which, on certain January mornings, was all the encouragement some folks needed to keep dragging their water buckets and dreams through the snow. As storms rolled over the land like tired giants tugging thick blankets, these humble hideouts sat quiet and unbothered, warmly tucked beneath the skin of the earth. They were not grand, but they endured, and in enduring became quietly heroic. While outside, the wind moaned like a playwright seeking mood. Inside those shelters, someone dozed by the fire, the stew simmered with calm optimism, and in the slow blink of candlelight, winter itself was gently outwitted. But survival didn't stop at sleeping in the ground. Next, it would involve sneaking warmth from nature in even bolder ways, by turning snow itself into shelter. Curl in deeper, and you'll see. Out in the endless hush of the deep northern forests, where snow draped itself like a dozing cat across the spines of pine trees, lived a certain breed of settler, not the loud, swashbuckling frontier type, But the quieter, clever folk who knew that surviving winter wasn't a contest of strength, but one of intelligent napping strategies and cunning use of moss. This, dear listener, was the age of the semi-subterranean shelter, otherwise known as the bourgeois cousin of the dirt hole. Picture this. You're perilously close to freezing your frock off, and instead of raising walls to fight the cold winds, you go underground like a wise root vegetable. These hidden havens were sometimes called soddies, though honestly, that sounds more like an underwhelming brand of herbal toothpaste. Sod houses were built partly into hillsides, snuggled beneath layers of insulating earth, with the roof often made from grass-covered turf. A green toupee of survival, if you will. In areas like the Great Plains, where trees were scarcer than a sincere sea shanty, settlers had little choice but to build from the materials the land grudgingly provided: soil, sod, and no small amount of stubbornness. Soddies weren't exactly glamorous. They had a way of gently shedding bits of ceiling into your soup, particularly after rain, and especially if one had taken liberties with the clay-to-grass ratio. But they were, as one grateful settler put it, close, dark, and smelled like livestock, but survivable. A 5-star review by 1860 standards. Now, imagine crawling into one of these, fire crackling faintly, the chimney more like an existential hope than a functioning pipe, and tucking yourself into a bed stuffed with straw and covered in a quilt thick as diplomacy. The roof sags a little, but it's held up by roughly harvested logs that still carry the gossip of the forest. Outside, the wind howls like it's trying out for an opera, but inside, blissful damp silence, smells a little like potatoes and whatever Aunt Clara's been fermenting. The main goal, after all, was not comfort, but continuity. While the soddy reigned in the plains, up in the woodlands, a different beast took root: the pit house. Built partially below ground, these were nature's answer to the basement apartment, sometimes called dugouts, though that term too seems to understate the ambition. A good pit house began with a hole, but one thoughtfully carved, part sunken womb of earth, part sparsely furnished hobbit dwelling. Early indigenous communities had long used similar designs, from Inuit Karmaks to the pit houses of the ancestral Puebloans, and European settlers, in a rare moment of humility, adopted techniques that had been working perfectly well for centuries. With a roof of layered bark, grass, and snow itself, a contradiction that actually works, like cold soup or polite pirates. These underground shanties were masterpieces of thermodynamics. Hot air lingered close, cold air stayed aloof, and wind simply shrugged at the prospect of digging. Heat would be trapped so efficiently that, in smaller shelters, it was possible to slowly bake a root vegetable over a fire while simultaneously sweating through your woolen long underwear. A balancing act that taught patience, and perhaps some modest deodorant skills. Of course, nothing was flawless. Rats were known to investigate these womb-like abodes, not out of malevolence, but a misunderstood sense of community. One woman from Nebraska reported that her family's dugout became acquainted with a raccoon of strong opinions, who refused to leave until offered 3 biscuits and half a pickle. Still, these primitive shelters worked, not by beating nature, but by blending thoughtfully with it, humbler, cozier, and infinitely more soil-scented than the romantic log cabins of folklore. They were not built with flair, but with foresight, the kind that says, yes, the window is actually just a hole, but in February, that hole is a luxury. And it wasn't only the structure, but the rituals inside that kept people alive. quilting circles doubled as intelligence briefings on frostbite. Peppering walls with dried herbs wasn't just decorative, it kept spirits high and insects confused. And storytelling, whispered over candles half drowned in their own wax, stitched the gaps between generations, reminding each that winter, like everything else, was survivable, with warmth, wit, and a really committed roof. So as the snow crisped against the edges of another dawn, and smoke rose in lazy spirals from invisible chimneys nestled low in the hills, another secret of survival slept gently beneath the frost. And just around the bend, settlers would soon find themselves engaging in the most improbable winter weapon of all, the stifling brilliance of sheep in the bedroom. Somewhere beyond the frost-bitten edge of what was once considered civilized, past the crumpled maps and cautious cartographer scribbles labeled "Here be drama," lay the settler-made wonders of snow country survival. And as winter dug in her heels, rather dramatically, the clever frontier folk revealed a quiet kind of genius, the art of snow insulation. Now, you might think snow is just frosty water fallen inconveniently from the sky, cold, wet, excellent for throwing at your cousin when he isn't looking. But settlers quickly discovered snow's more agreeable side. It's surprisingly good at hugging warmth, if you know how to build with it. You see, when constructing a traditional log cabin in winter, the usual tools, axes, saws, and drama, were slowed by the season's icy grip. The ground was frozen, the logs were stiff with frost, and the pace of construction made syrup look hasty. And so, rather than battle nature at her sassiest, some settlers decided to work with her. Enter the snow house, not to be mistaken for its glamorous cousin, the Arctic igloo. This was the rustic version. Northern European immigrants, Scandinavian by ancestry and slightly masochistic by hobby, repurposed their knowledge of sod houses, kombucha fermentation, and very thick coats to fashion shelters partly carved out of snow drifts themselves. They dig backwards into a hill of packed snow, not unlike rabbits, but with more plaid, and hollow out a cozy chamber just big enough for the essentials: a fire pit, a bed of pine boughs, and at least 2 cups of extremely regretful tea. Then they'd cover the entrance with skins or even blocks of snow, as nature intended. The interior, once insulated with snow walls and body heat, stayed surprisingly warm, or at least survivably nippy. Inside one of these wintry hideouts, your average settler family might be found rubbing mittens together, cooking elk stew over a carefully watched flame, and debating whether this was indeed better than just fleeing to Charleston. As the wind howled its opinion past the snow-blocking entrance, they'd share stories, fix socks, and invent new reasons not to fetch more firewood. An underrated survival instinct, if you ask me. And from the outside, these snow rooms disappeared almost entirely, which had, depending on who you asked, multiple upsides. For one, you were insulated from not just the cold, but from bears who weren't in the mood for conversation. Secondly, wandering neighbors were less likely to drop by unannounced. And third, the low visibility helped keep the shelter secure from any less than friendly travelers with unclear intentions and even worse baking skills. The snow shelter, while a bit cramped and always slightly damp, was a marvel of minimalism. The kind of place Marie Kondo might wander into and say, "Wow, this really sparks survival." In some settlements, these winter homes were part of a shifting annual rhythm. A cabin was for summer and fall. The snow shelter, the frostified hobbit hole of frontierland, was the backup plan tucked beneath the earth or snowdrift, like a seasonal sock drawer. when the wind turned cruel and firewood grew distant, folks would retreat to the underground nooks, stash supplies, and ride out the worst of it, not by fighting the storm, but by quietly outwaiting it. Some settlers even designed these hideaways beforehand, digging late into the autumn when the ground was softer, then covering the entrances before snow arrived, ready to reclaim it when the blizzards came stomping in like ill-mannered guests. Archaeologists, bless their chilled fingers, have occasionally found remnants of these handmade hibernation huts, depressions in the earth where warmth once lingered, ashes from tiny hearths, bits of broken crockery, traces of past persistence. It's easy to romanticize these humble snow sanctuaries, especially when you're listening from beneath a thick comforter and the biggest winter challenge nearby is deciding between chamomile or cocoa. But to the early settlers, these shelters were more than cozy hidey holes. They were quiet declarations of, "Not today, frostbite." Because whether you're a trapper, a tanner, or just someone with terrible timing and a dream of land ownership, you learn fast. Survival isn't always about strength, but about cleverness. And a little snow handled the right way becomes not just a problem, but a solution wearing a very cold hat. Eventually, as snow gave way to slush, and slush grumbled its way into thaw, the settlers would crack open those frosty doorways, squint into the new sunlight, and rediscover their wooden cabins, blissfully unaware of the squirrels who had taken squatting rights. But before spring comes, we must visit another trick of snowy cunning, one practiced by clever communities who found warmth not in solitude, but in shared underground secrets. By the time early settlers greeted their third or fourth winter in the New World, most had begun to realize that sheer stubbornness, while admirable, was not a valid heating strategy. Stubbornness could not thaw boots or keep powdered wigs from icing over. But ingenuity, now that, could fill your socks with warmth and perhaps a little smoke. Enter the world of hidden earth shelters, one of the settlers' best kept, everyone knows this, but no one talks about it, secrets. These were not just holes in the ground, mind you. No, these were frontier bunkers disguised as mole real estate, low to the earth, secretive, and designed less for aesthetics and more for survival. To the untrained eye, they looked like nothing more than grassy lumps or dejected hills that had given up trying. But inside, they were miniature fortresses against the howling cold. Their structure rested on a charmingly simple concept our ancestors borrowed from Mother Nature herself. If burrowing works for badgers, groundhogs, and suspiciously intelligent rabbits, why not people? These shelters, often called pit houses or dugouts, were carved into hillsides when possible, or sunken directly into flat plains if necessary. Builders would select a site with decent drainage, ideally uphill from where their neighbors' pigs relieved themselves, and start digging as though the survival of their toes depended on it. Because in fact, it did. Once a pit big enough to comfortably fit a family, and at least 3 disappointed chickens was dug, they'd line the walls with timber and moss, creating insulation thick enough to muffle both the wind and the occasional marital disagreement. The roof, usually made from logs and sod, helped trap rising warmth, and also hosted the occasional gopher who thought he'd stumbled onto a luxury condo. The dugout's cozy quarters weren't just warmer, they were also remarkably discreet. In times of conflict or harsh weather, a good dugout was nearly invisible save for a modestly smoking chimney poking through the thatch like a confused periscope. One such marvel of homemade architecture was reportedly built by a settler named Ethan Grimsby. whose dramatic aversion to frostbite led him to innovate well beyond the typical earthen dwelling. Ethan's version included a sloped entryway to trap cold air away from the living quarters, a side nook for storing potatoes, and occasionally hiding from his in-laws, and a rudimentary ventilation shaft that often doubled as a squirrel superhighway. Incredibly, Ethan also devised a way to preheat his socks. He strung a line across his fireplace mantle, draping his woolen foot wraps like tiny sleepy flags of surrender. In this, he achieved what few men of his era could: truly warm feet in January. While urban colonists might have chuckled at the notion of living underground, like a beetroot with a mortgage, one alleged critic scoffed. Those in harsher frontiers knew the truth. Winter didn't care for manners, and shelter was survival. Even George Washington, who had the unfortunate experience of wintering at Valley Forge, benefited from a variation on this theme. Soldiers dug into hillsides, built log and earth quarters, and learned that being a revolutionary patriot did not make one immune to chattering teeth or frozen inkpots. In Scandinavia, indigenous Sami peoples had perfected this kind of wisdom long before buckled shoes became popular. Their earth-covered goatees, a type of semi-permanent shelter, blended so seamlessly into the tundra that one could easily pass a dozen without ever realizing a family, a fire, and maybe a rather judgmental reindeer lived just beneath. The theme here is unmistakable. When the wind bites, the earth hugs back. There's a poetic softness to the practicality of it all, that humans, in their most vulnerable moments, instinctively return to the womb of the world. Just a bit of earth, some timber, and hope wrapped in moss. And so, night after night, settlers hunkered down in their gentle hideaways. They simmered beans and told stories under low ceilings. They counted icicles hanging from the roof and imagined them as sleepy teeth of a slumbering beast. Winter itself, just above their sod-covered heads. Outside, the snow piled on. Inside, warmth held on even harder. Speaking of warmth, there's a particularly curious tale about settlers who used hay bales not just as roofs, but as dinner tables, mattresses, and, on rare occasions, conversation partners. But we'll drift dreamily into that straw-stuffed world soon enough. If you were trudging through a snow-covered forest in New England sometime in the early 1700s, your breath frosting in the air and your boots sinking with every reluctant step, you might pass by what looks like just another modest mound of earth blanketed in snow, innocent, inconspicuous, boring even. But there's a mischievous little trick hidden beneath that lumpy exterior. A trick older settlers whispered about like it was some sort of culinary secret, passed between grandmothers and woodcutters. That mound you see wasn't just a hill. It was a wigwam, or a dugout, or something between an underground fort and a very determined mole's living room. When winter took the land in its frosty, unyielding grip, the settlers, who were, let's be honest, often just one blizzard away from being human popsicles, had to get creative. Timber was precious, time was short, and shivering was nobody's favorite pastime. So they learned, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by imitation, the ancient art of building below. Below what? Well, mostly below the wind. The settlers discovered that Mother Earth, when politely burrowed into, could offer a rather decent degree of insulation, far more hospitable than standing around waiting for their eyebrows to thaw. Some called them pit houses. Others referred to them as earth lodges. Whatever the phrasing, the idea was refreshingly simple and deeply clever. Dig down, not up. The basic blueprint went something like this. Find a modest slope or clearing near a water source, because nobody wants to chip through a frozen puddle every morning just to get tea water. Then dig yourself a nice, roomy pit, about 3 to 5 feet deep, depending on ambition and available free labor. Line the walls with logs or tightly packed stone. Lay branches across the top to create a latticey ceiling structure. Throw animal hides, bark, and finally a whole lot of dirt over it. Voila! Your very own Hobbit-style winter condo, complete with central heating, if you count a fire pit in the middle and a hole in the roof for ventilation. Now, it wasn't exactly winter at Versailles, but it was warm enough to prevent frostbite from claiming your nose in the night. Indigenous peoples, who had been surviving these climates for generations with ingenuity and grace, were often the reluctant instructors to their wide-eyed, frost-bitten colonist neighbors. Tribes like the Mandan, Pawnee, and Hidatsa had long used semi-subterranean structures suited for punishing winters. Unlike the settlers, they had the foresight not to build their homes straight up into the icy wind like an architectural dare. The settlers gradually found themselves copying, not always well, but earnestly. Of course, sometimes this cultural borrowing lacked permission or finesse, as was rather on brand for colonial expansion. Still, one has to imagine that for every frost-shocked European who stumbled into the idea of an earth lodge, there was a moment of grateful reverence, or at least low-level awe between chattering teeth. Inside these underground havens, life didn't stop. It simmered. Children played quiet games by firelight, their laughter muffled by thick earthen walls. Meals were cooked low and slow, the scent of stews and salted meats lingering in the warm, smoky air. Snowstorms came and went outside, snorting their icy disapproval that anyone dared be comfortable. Yet within those humble mounds, people endured. Some even thrived. And let us hand out a little gold star to the added benefit. Camouflaged homes blended snugly with the surrounding wilderness, which, in the colder and more paranoid colonial years, became an unseen yet crucial advantage. After all, if rival settlers couldn't see your house, they might stop burning it down for a change. Huzzah for dirt disguise. Over time, these shelters earned affectionate nicknames: snow burrows, hearth holes. One family in Pennsylvania reportedly dubbed theirs Old Belly, because it kept them warm and rumbled when the fire roared. Naming your shelter after a body part. Endearingly weird. But hey, when winter's claws dig deep, who's to argue with warmth? As snows fell heavier and the wind began its nightly concert in the trees above, these underground lairs stood firm, cozy, resolute, a symbol of stubborn human ingenuity cocooned in frost. And speaking of cozy, what became of the hearth at the center of it all? The glowing heart of survival, flickering beneath the earth's surface, like a tiny sun hiding under blankets. That, dear listener, was another piece of the secret, a tale of fire, soot, and smoke signals misread. But we'll let that part rise gently with the embers. Next time, in the dense hush of early colonial winters when snow fell so thickly that it muffled even the creaks of groaning trees, settlers were getting increasingly clever with their hideaways. Not in a flashy architectural digest kind of way, mind you. No, nothing with vaulted ceilings or an open concept hearth. But with the sort of ingenuity that you only summon when frostbite has the audacity to knock on your toes at dawn. Among these quietly brilliant ideas was one that slipped under the radar of mainstream history classes: the earth-bermed pit house. Now, to modern ears, pit house might sound more like a poor Yelp review than a viable winter escape. but to a weary settler living on stale root vegetables and the occasional weasel. The pit house was a marvel of rustic engineering, a sort of hobbit house, if the hobbits had only 2 chickens, perpetual frostbite, and no budget. The idea was simple enough. Dig a depression in the earth, ideally below the frost line. Then construct a low, wooden frame, roof it with poles, cover the whole thing with branches, sod, and about as much dirt as nature would allow without collapsing in a huff. Why underground? Because long before humans had central heating, they figured out the dirt was up to something mysterious, namely, staying a reasonable temperature when everything above it turned into an ice sculpture exhibit. Some pit houses were circular, others were oval, and a few grew into sprawling underground hallways with sleeping alcoves cleverly separated by hanging quilts. Imagine frost-rimmed breath in the thin light of an oil lamp, the scent of juniper smoke curling through the ceiling vent, and your dog stealing the warmest spot near the fire pit for the 5th night in a row. The truly elite installations, we're talking luxury pit house caliber, boasted clever airflow systems. Settlers would build smoke holes with a second vent at ground level, forcing a draft that pulled in fresh air and prevented everyone from slowly becoming smoked venison in their sleep. And really, avoiding accidental indoor smoking was a key hallmark of success back then. These humble structures weren't fully original to the colonists, though. They were inspired by, and in many cases learned directly from, Native American winter dwellings such as the earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa, or the semi-subterranean homes of the Chinook in the Pacific Northwest. Indigenous engineering was already masterfully tied to the rhythms of the local seasons and geography, and settlers who paid attention had a significantly higher chance of not turning into unfortunate cautionary tales. Of course, there were those who dismissed such underground homes as savage huts, who insisted on square cabins with drafty log walls and charismatic but entirely ineffective chimneys. These folks generally got frost in their trousers and humility in their outlook by the start of the second blizzard. Back underground, life in a pit house was both cozy and comically cramped. Kids would sleep 3 to a bed, piled like kindling. Tools hung overhead on beams smeared with raccoon grease to discourage mice from using them as jungle gyms. The family goose might do double duty as a watchdog and foot warmer, honking ferociously if anyone dared approach the entrance flap. And oh, the flap. Usually made from piled furs or woven marsh grasses, it served as front door, insulation system, and sometimes emergency sled if the weather took a particularly dramatic turn. But even here, in a hut small enough that your elbows knew everyone's secrets, families would light candles, crack nuts by the hearth, tell stories passed down from frostier generations, and ward off the bitter world above with laughter that steamed gently in the lamplight. True, you had to duck when standing. And yes, the potatoes occasionally froze if a cold spell snuck through a badly daubed corner. But living in a pit house meant surviving the unsurvivable and, in a curious way, thriving beneath the very earth that tried to bury you in snow each year. And as storm winds howled above like wolves gossiping in the treetops, the settlers beneath the soil would pull their quilts a little higher and feel something shockingly modern. Central heat, courtesy of geology. Curl in deeper now, for the next part of our tale slides us gently toward another kind of buried brilliance, one quietly hidden beneath the snowdrifts and the pine needles. A smoky trick for staying warm without chopping a single log. Just beyond the firelit circle of the hearth, where the logs sighed and snapped in their birch bark jackets, there lay a curious kind of silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something waiting. It was the stillness of a world wrapped in snow, and within that quiet cocoon, our brave and frost-nibbled forebears had a particular trick up their woolen sleeves. Beneath many of the humbler log homes of early settlers, especially in those icy northern territories where even the deer wore disgruntled expressions, there often hid something more mysterious than one might expect. An underground room, not a cellar, such as one might store turnips in, though turnips were indeed present and plentiful, but something far cleverer, known in hushed whispers, and by hushed whispers we mean practical frontier folk with a knack for understatement, as the dugout chamber. These secret-ish survival shelters were the winter equivalent of a hidden chocolate stash. Constructed with a shrewd blend of local knowledge and mild desperation, these chambers were embedded into hillsides or dug straight into the frozen earth, timber-lined, topped with sod, and sometimes disguised with a seemingly innocent pile of firewood or a grumpy goat. In snowbound times, they served as warm retreats, insulated naturally by the surrounding soil. Settlers quickly discovered that while wolves and wind howled overhead, the ground itself stayed a stoic and reliable incubator of heat, or at least a version of it that didn't result in frostbitten toes. Wisely, many such chambers were not entirely detached from the main house. Tunnels, often no higher than a stooping man and no wider than a large wheel of cheddar, connected them to the main structure. This meant that even when storms raged like a temperamental artist above, a cautious family could steal away underground like stovepipe-hatted hobbits, carrying candles and marmalade to go wait out the worst of winter's scorn. Some families took this even further. In particularly bleak seasons, they used the chamber not just for survival, but as a spare living room of sorts. Tales abound, quiet ones naturally, of children learning their letters by tallow light, chickens roosting smugly on roof beams, and entire households listening to the wind above, while playing games best described as early American boredom management. The most popular being guess which turnip I'm thinking of. It had rules, kind of. Of course, no good secret shelter would be complete without equally secret knowledge about how to build and maintain one. Knowledge passed between families, often guarded like a prized recipe. These weren't the kind of things you'd find in books, not because books didn't exist, but because books didn't have frostbite, nor did they advise you whether to roof your chamber with pine or spruce. Answer: spruce smells nicer, pine keeps the bugs contemplative. And speaking of contemplative bugs, it was not uncommon for these below-ground bunkers to come with uninvited guests. Mice, of course. They'd sneak in whether you invited them or not, especially if you had grain or mittens or, really, anything at all. But also beetles, modest spiders, and the occasional very lost raccoon. The settlers accepted these tiny squatters with the kind of resigned hospitality that comes from living in a world where yesterday's candle was today's lunch. What makes these dugout shelters fascinating, aside from their undeniable coziness and structural pluck, is how invisible they often were to outsiders. From above, they masqueraded as nothing at all. A hill, perhaps, a lump near the root cellar. In times of unrest or unexpected visitors, say unfriendly patrols or overly chatty neighbors, they offered not only warmth, but discretion, a secret room of quiet comfort and canned beans. So while most imagine frontier life as an unrelenting battle with the elements, and to be clear, it often was, it also contained this hidden undercurrent of ingenuity. settlers layering the landscape with cleverness, carving out warmth where none seemed to exist, and looking around the frozen world as if to say, "All right, Mother Nature, let's play." And as the stars blinked overhead, hidden from view beneath tree root and soil, families curled up in their sleeping cots in these cozy, earth-dug dens, their breath clouding faintly into the candlelit air, while logs above creaked in protest as the wind tried once again to push its way in. But the settlers weren't worried. They had their shelter, a roasted parsnip or two, and the quiet patience earned from 1,000 long winters. Which brings us, rather gently, to another curious strategy, one that involves snow, shoes, and an argument about which side of a deer is the warmer one. Northern winds howled across the frost-bitten plains like a pack of lonesome wolves composing sad poetry. Snow draped the earth like a misplaced wedding veil, and trees stood in silent admiration of their icy overcoats. In the narrow distance, a little curl of smoke twisted upward from under a mound of snow. No chimney, no house visible, just that lazy wisp of warmth pirouetting into the frozen sky. Down beneath this snow-capped mystery was a shelter not unlike something a resourceful mole might build if it had opposable thumbs and mild claustrophobia. And it is here, under frost, forest floor, and roughly 30 inches of carefully reinforced dirt, that the early settlers' genius takes center stage. You see, we're not talking log cabins with creaky doors and snow piling up on leaky roofs. No, tonight, we step quietly into the world of the pit house, something that sounds a tad ominous at first, as if you might encounter it on a bad date with medieval architecture. But in truth, pit houses were early pioneers' secret weapon against the brutal winters that prowled across northern lands like a cranky house cat looking for uninsulated homes. Carved into the earth, pit houses were semi-subterranean dwellings that whispered wisdom from ancient peoples as far-flung as Siberian tribes, the ancestral Puebloans, and later, even clever colonists in places like the Pacific Northwest. Simply put, when the wind sliced through your woolen coat like a butter knife through surprisingly expensive churned butter, it was time to dig. These shelters, often just a few feet deep, use the Earth's natural insulation. Below a certain depth, soil maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round, like nature saying, "Don't worry, I got you." Some modern root cellars still capitalize on this, but early settlers used it to guarantee survival. The pit house offered a humble 50-something degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of winter. Chilly, yes, but compared to a blizzard flinging icy tantrums at your face, it practically felt like spring break. Now, let's paint the picture inside. Imagine ducking through a narrow tunnel-like entryway, just enough to feel like a hobbit on a chilly spa retreat, wrapped in furs, with a smoky torch guiding your way. What greeted you wasn't luxury, but it was love. Packed earth walls, a central trench for a fire, with carefully arranged stones to absorb the warmth, pine needles or woven mats made for humble but effective flooring. And yes, even these early dwellers battled smoke ventilation strategies like low-budget steam engineers. A well-built pit house featured a hole in the roof, just large enough to release the smoke, but not large enough to invite snowballs to attend the dinner party. This ingenious system sometimes included a small vertical shaft lined in bark or stone, acting as a flue. It wasn't perfect. More than one settler woke up smelling not unlike an oversmoked ham, but live they did. Communities that relied on pit houses didn't do it accidentally. These were designs often passed down over generations, adjusted slowly through icy trial and error, The Tlingit people of the Pacific coast, for instance, developed pit-style dwellings with cedar frames and bark walls, structures that withstood meteorological misbehavior with dignified stubbornness. Meanwhile, over on the prairies, Métis families sometimes built hybrid turf sod shelters that were partly sunken and partly above ground, like architectural mullets, business below, party on top. Perhaps the loveliest feature of these underground retreats was how snugly they brought people together. Not a lot of room for social distancing here. Shared warmth, shared tasks, shared stories. Grandmothers kneading bannock dough, while children pressed ears close to frozen ground to hear the galloping, gossipy footsteps of winter approaching. Fathers whittling spoons out of birch. The occasional chess game played with carved stones. Bishop replaced by a confused pebble. Everything smelled a little like damp wool and roasted roots. It was tight living, but it was living. And because the shelters were often carefully hidden beneath nature's frosted blanket, they offered a strategic bonus. Invaders were far less likely to spot a settling community that looked more like a mole colony than a town. Not that most attackers relished the idea of storming a frozen oatmeal bog, but discretion is the better part of snowball fodder. Still, creating these shelters took a year planning, instinct, and a shovel. Sometimes a very determined stick. When facing 6 months of cold so aggressive it burned your eyebrows off while sneezing, nothing short of ingenuity would suffice. So beneath the twinkling stars and blanket of snow, these settlers slept, huddled close and warmed by earth, fire, and their own quiet cleverness. Sheltered from the storm above, they dreamed of wild flowers and wild berries, and early springs that always felt too far away. And beneath the whispers of the trees and the cozy breath of the soil, something else stirred. A new design, a strange improvement perhaps, nearly forgotten by time, but bound to make its chilly debut. By the early 1700s, it would be safe to assume that folks trudging through snowdrifts in the northern colonies had grown tired of freezing off their personal ambitions. And they had. But colonial winters weren't particularly interested in people's feelings. They favoured frostbite. So the settlers did what exhausted, clever people do. They got sneaky. That's when the forest floor became full of secrets. Not just squirrels storing away acorns for a snowy Tuesday, but humans too, skimming knowledge from native communities, borrowing ideas without citation marks, and digging in. Quite literally. Enter the pit house, which, let's be honest, sounds less like a shelter and more like the world's least appealing Airbnb listing. But don't be fooled by the name. It was one of the oldest, most effective winter survival hacks in the pre-furnace world. A semi-subterranean structure, half buried like it was trying not to be seen by the wind. Builders would dig a shallow pit, sometimes only a few feet deep. But when you're the temperature of a popsicle, those few feet feel like beachfront luxury. These cozy, earthen hideaways could trace much of their design inspiration to indigenous traditions. The Mandan, the ancestral Puebloans, and many nations before them had already spent centuries perfecting the art of sleeping underground without becoming moldy. They knew how to insulate walls with sod, frame roofs with timber, and most crucially, where not to build, which was anywhere that reminded a beaver of water. European settlers, most of whom had the outdoor survival instincts of a particularly distracted zucchini, eventually caught on. Overwhelmed by the theatrics of winter and their own ill-suited English cottages, they began adapting. Some early American colonists built dugouts, especially in the harsh prairies and northern woods. These weren't glamorous. But if you ever find yourself sleeping in a room so cold, your breath forms temporary art installations. A muddy hole with a fire pit starts to feel polite. The walls were often reinforced with logs or stones, the floors covered with straw or pine needles, and insulation involved everything from animal hides to dried grass. If it could trap warmth and wasn't on fire, into the dugout it went. Now, these shelters were not only warm, they were deliciously apologetic to the wind. Instead of shouting, "Here I am," like a grand 2-story farmhouse silhouetted against a snowstorm, they kept a low profile, quite literally. Most of the heat stayed in, and most of the wolves stayed out, which is the exact balance you want in life. Then there was the delightful invention of the sod house, especially popular in the treeless open plains, where wood was rarer than good bedtime stories. These earthen abodes were made quite literally from the land itself. Strips of sod cut with roots in place, stacked like soggy bricks. They were quirky, moist, and shaped a bit like hobbit condos, but pioneers adored them. Sod houses had thick, insulating walls, which meant no one had to wake up in the middle of the night and break the ice off their blanket. Of course, these innovations weren't limited to physical design. People also grew suspiciously good at fooling the weather with tools. They buried food in root cellars deep below the frost line. Basically, nature's refrigerator, only without the humming. Some settlers even tried capturing scarce heat with reflective materials, lining hearth walls with shiny tin or mica, ensuring their fireplaces gave off as much glow as a candlelit complement. They'd also construct their beds raised off the ground, because as any self-respecting 17th century insomniac knew, cold air has manners. It sinks politely to the floor. And to keep toasty, families often slept together in shared featherbeds. Not for romance, just good old-fashioned biological insulation. It's like cuddling, only everyone's grumbling and wearing 3 wool petticoats. And somewhere, in the cozy glow of a low fire, with frost painting delicate swirls on the glass and snow piling up like nature's decorative throw pillows, weary settlers might finally fall asleep. Their homes weren't perfect. They dripped, creaked, and occasionally hosted squirrels, uninvited. But by embracing the ground beneath their boots, they learned that sometimes the best way to weather a storm is to hunker down just out of sight. Now, as the wind gently stirs the treetops and a soft hush covers the land in white, we turn our gaze toward the hearth itself, where the flicker of firelight begins to reveal yet another layer in the settler's slow-burn survival strategy. When the wind howled like an unpaid opera singer and the snow piled up high enough to make a moose feel short, early settlers knew better than to rely solely on a good coat and a can-do attitude. They needed structure, a literal one. Welcome to the curious world of pit houses. Sounds glamorous, right? But don't let the name fool you. These were secret survival bunkers long before bunkers got a PR glow-up and started appearing on home renovation shows. Typically dug into the earth, the pit house was about as visible as a whispered insult in a blizzard. The floor might sit 2 or even 3 feet below ground level, protected by the natural insulation of the surrounding soil. Walls, often made from a mix of timber, mud, and the kind of sticks one might overlook on a woodland stroll, each one now moonlighting as a structural beam. The roof was usually conical or flat, crafted from more logs, thatch, or sod, held together by sheer stubborn hope and human ingenuity. Together, these ingredients created a home so snug you'd half expect to find a crackling fireplace, a cat in a knitted bonnet, and a pot of mulled pine sap on the boil. In Arctic zones like what's now Alaska and northern Canada, the Inuit people built semi-subterranean dwellings called kamaks. These were equal parts snow science and survival wizardry. The ground-level entrances kept out the cutting wind, and heat from seal oil lamps, people, and the odd stubborn dog made interior temperatures downright decadent when compared to the frigid world above. Of course, ducks and snowshoe hares were noticeably absent from these blueprints, having wisely opted to live in less complicated arrangements. Not to be outdone, the Navajo in the southwestern region built hogans, rounded earthen homes with a front door facing east to greet the morning sun. Because even in the face of survival, it's best to be polite to celestial bodies. While not buried like pit houses, hogans were earth-hugging enough to retain warmth during crisp desert nights. Thick logs created the skeleton of the structure, usually coated in a mixture of mud and bark, with the occasional spiritual blessing. Preferably before winter, not after. Then there were settler adaptations with additional flair. Ingenious constructions like soddies or sod houses. These were popular on the American Great Plains, where trees were about as common as antique shops on Mars. Settlers cut bricks of earth, grass and roots, whole chunk-like pastries of prairie, and stacked them into walls. Imagine living in a house made of brownies. Now remove all joy, replace cocoa with dirt, and casually add a leaky roof and maybe some snakes. Still, it worked, and it kept the heat in with a loyalty many coats could only dream of. One charming hazard of sod houses was that grass roofs had a tendency to bloom in spring. Waking up to dandelions poking through your ceiling does introduce a certain rustic romance, though it does make hanging paintings rather pointless. Also, rain could turn the ceiling into something of a marsh, but hey, free mud facials. In colder climes, where building into the earth wasn't enough, folks got clever with smoke. They'd create a central fire pit, lined with rocks and fed with seasoned wood, a luxury item, and above it, they'd construct a smoke hole carefully engineered to leak only the right amount of warmth. Too big, and you were sending heat straight to the heavens. Too small, and the dwelling became a very cozy, very smoky sauna that no one asked for. There were entire winters where families sat together, beaming with pride in their fine ducting, until a raccoon came crashing down the vent and undid 5 months of peace and quiet. Despite these imperfections, these shelters were marvels of environmental adaptation. They didn't just keep people alive. They gave birth to communities, to laughter muffled under furs, to warm bowls of something vaguely root-based. Within these structures, history simmered slowly. Hushed conversations, snores from every direction, and occasionally the sound of someone stepping into a snow-filled boot because someone else forgot to bring them inside. You know who you are. And just beyond their small earthen doors, winters blustered and blew, but inside, glowing coals, shared stories, and a determination not to freeze, thank you very much. Now that we've cozied ourselves into the earthy walls of these underground homes, our next stop whispers of traps hidden beneath snowdrifts. Clever contraptions meant not to catch, cold, but dinner. As the snow began to pile upon the wooded ribs of the new world, early settlers faced a season that didn't politely knock. It shouldered the door open, deposited 3 feet of snow on the hearth, and asked what was for dinner. This was winter at its most theatrical, complete with shrieking winds, frostbitten optimism, and the kind of weather that made even trees reconsider their life choices. But rather than curl up and give in to the long, icy siege, some settlers had an ace up their fur-lined sleeves. they started building structures that weren't obvious from the outside. Secret, subtle, and, in many cases, sunken. So began the curious fashion of the pit house. Now, if you're picturing a settler falling into a hole shouting, "Guess I live here now," well, you're not entirely wrong. But this was no random ditch. Pit houses, or sometimes called dugouts, were cold weather ingenuity at its most grounded, literally. You see, the idea was gloriously simple. Dig down, not up. Earth, it turns out, is an excellent insulator. Below the surface, the temperature stays far more temperate than what's happening above, where the wind howls like a ghost that didn't get invited to Thanksgiving. So settlers would excavate a large depression, sometimes 6 feet deep, and build a roof over it using logs, brush, sod, or whatever wasn't already frozen stiff. The entryway was often just a clever tunnel carved into the side, long and low, designed for minimal heat loss and maximal mystery. From the outside, it might have looked like a misshapen molehill or a suspiciously lumpy bush. But inside, warmth, quiet, and one big shared bed of leaves and hay, with the occasional suspect foot in your face during the night. These shelters weren't exactly the Ritz. No silver spoons or cushions, unless hay counts as a cushion. But in a storm, they were cavernous havens. A central hearth helped warm the chamber, and smoke often escaped through a small vent in the roof, or simply through any cracks that hadn't been sealed with clay, moss, or desperation. Of course, there were some quirks. Being underground came with the occasional surprise. An uninvited guest of the rodent variety, or condensation droplets dripping from the roof directly onto one's sleeping brow. It was life lived close to the earth, sometimes too close, especially if the dwelling flooded after a thaw. Nothing like waking up in a cold puddle to remind you that you're at nature's mercy. Still, these homes were marvels of necessity. From the Great Plains to the dense forests of the Northeast, pit houses were utilized by various pioneering groups, and they weren't new. Indigenous peoples had mastered subterranean housing for centuries, with designs that balanced ventilation, warmth, and, most importantly, survival. European settlers, ever so slightly less prepared for American winters than they'd pretended to be during the crossing, took notes, sometimes borrowed the whole blueprint. And in communities where building materials were scarce, or buried beneath 7 blizzards worth of snow, digging down was more achievable than cobbling together a colonial chalet. Some of the most impressive examples were found in the Scandinavian settlements, where Norwegians carried with them age-old traditions of turf homes and under-earth bunkers, as if they had winter in their DNA. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were experiences, with benches made of packed earth, ventilation shafts like inverted chimneys, and soft pelts hung across the walls, possibly to muffle the sound of toes being stepped on during the night. Life inside these shelters may have been humble, but it was also intensely communal. You had to share warmth, stories, food, and space, and sometimes the uncomfortable awareness that someone hadn't bathed since the leaves turned. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And nothing builds community quite like surviving February in a basement that occasionally doubles as a puddle. As winter continued to stretch its icy fingers across the wilderness, pit houses sprang up like secrets stitched into the land. Beautifully obscure, quietly life-saving. The snow could fall as thickly as it liked. Underground, the fires still burned, the breath still steamed, and the settlers dreamed of spring. In the next gentle turn of our journey, we snuggle into even cozier corners where shelter takes on an even stranger, more ingenious form. when snow itself becomes the builder, not the threat. As the sun dipped beneath the snow-laced treetops, casting long shadows across a frozen landscape, early settlers across the northern woodlands of what's now the United States and Canada took comfort in a peculiar little trick of human ingenuity. Something small and earthen, half dug and half dreamed into being. The root cellar. Now, before your mind jumps to a glamorous subterranean ballroom for root vegetables, spoiler, it was decidedly less romantic. But in the quiet, clever frugality of the 18th and early 19th century, the root cellar was nothing short of revolutionary. And in the grueling winters where temperatures dropped faster than a conspiracy theory at a town hall meeting, these humble hollows became the lifeline of the homestead. Constructed most often by hand, these cellar shelters were dug into hillsides or sunk vertically into the earth, usually with more gumption than geometry. Walls were lined with stone if you were lucky, timber if you were ambitious, and good intentions if you were out of both. The concept was beautifully simple. Dig deep enough, and the earth itself would regulate temperature, keeping perishables from perishing and humans from perishing even faster. In particularly brutal climates, some settlers even turned their root cellars into temporary sleeping quarters during cold snaps. Imagine descending a tiny ladder, candle in hand, into a frost-proof cocoon lined with jars of pickled beans, sacks of potatoes, and, if Ma had a wild side, an illicit jug of applejack buried behind the turnips. It wasn't exactly the Ritz, but when the winds howled and the frost bit at your eyebrows, it offered something close to sanctuary, not to mention convenient midnight snack options. Of course, the root cellar wasn't just about avoiding frostbite and fermenting in peace. It was also a display of folksy food science, before refrigeration was a sparkle in some inventor's eye. Temperatures a few feet underground remain remarkably stable year-round, usually between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the depth, insulation, and favoritism of nearby gophers. Humidity was controlled with ventilation shafts cleverly disguised as bird perches or very confused chimneys. It was the kind of passive design that modern architects whisper reverently at dinner parties. Settlers learned how to position their cellars strategically. North-facing hillocks were preferred, where the sun wouldn't warm the structure too much in summer. And in a delightful show of frontier optimism, early homemakers even decorated the entrances, not with wreaths or welcome mats that would have bordered on scandalous, but maybe with a carved wooden sign that read Taters & Co. or Turnip Trust Vault. And every so often, these cozy earthen nooks became more than storage or storm shelters. In communities close enough to share gossip but far enough to mind their fences, children sometimes transformed these cellars into secret forts, while teenagers turned them into clandestine meeting spots that made history, just not the kind great-grandma would chronicle in her diary. Between the pickled beets and the dried corn lay whispers of adolescent rebellion, coded love notes, and one earnest attempt to build a functioning wind-powered potato launcher. In extreme winters, the cellar's insulating abilities could mean the difference between spoiled food or survival, especially in the vast timber-bound interiors of Maine, Minnesota, or Upper Canada. Sometimes families with collapsing roofs from heavy snowfall would spend evenings huddled not in the parlor or the hearthroom, but in these small earth-womb spaces, their breath fogging lantern glass, while snow accumulated above them like nature's very slow-layered lasagna. And then, just as delicately as they were descended into, spring would arrive, and with it, muddy boots, thawing foundations, and a general re-evaluation of spending quite so much time underground. But thanks to clever engineering, stubborn resolve, and a cultural tolerance for the scent of onions at all hours, the root cellar had done its weary, waiting job. And with the snow just starting to melt away from the tops of the hills, with rivulets carving through the ice and dripping merrily through stone walls, the settlers turned their eyes upward once again, not to the sky, but to the trees, because a new secret of winter survival was hiding just above the ground, in the bark, the branches, and in the oldest syrupy secrets of the forest. A good trapdoor is a wonderful thing, especially if it's hidden under a rug, tucked beside a fireplace, and leads down into a world where winter can't quite reach you, not with its frostbite teeth and howling breath. Our colonial ancestors, those flint-eyed survivors of many a frostbitten dawn, knew a thing or two about turning a hole in the earth into a 4-star escape plan. These secret survival shelters, known in some circles as root cellars, and in more dramatic circles as the only reason everyone didn't freeze or starve to death, were marvels of low-tech ingenuity. The settlers were many things: rugged, tenacious, and sometimes a bit dramatic in their journal entries, but above all else, they were practical. When the winter winds came loping in like wolves through the cracks in their log cabins, they simply stepped down into the ground. With a wooden ladder groaning slightly beneath the soles of heavy boots, you might descend into a world that smelled of slightly questionable onions, pickled confidence, and honest-to-goodness turnips. And while it wasn't glamorous, it smelled more basement than boudoir. It offered 3 immeasurable treasures: food, warmth, and silence. The design of these cellars was deceptively clever. Earth walls kept the temperature steady, like nature's own thermostat. Thick doors, often camouflaged by snowdrifts, sealed out the worst of the cold. And the shelves, lined with salted meat, jars of fruit preserves, strings of garlic like tiny savory chandeliers, were as close to abundance as one could reasonably expect while snow buried every living thing up to its eyebrows. Some root cellars doubled as storm shelters, and a wise family might even turn one into a small winter quarters when the mercury plummeted. Throw in some pine boughs for bedding, a lantern for company, and the company of a family cat named Buttons curled up in the corner, and you had everything essential for a mid-February sabbatical from civilization, or at least from frostbite. In New England especially, where the winters arrive with a kind of theatrical flair, oh look, it's snowing sideways again, folks became quite inventive. They dug cellars into hillsides like makeshift hobbit holes, sometimes reinforcing them with fieldstone walls. These shelters weren't just about storing food. They stored peace of mind. Knowing you had 20 jars of rhubarb relish and an emergency barrel of cider could do wonders for one's nerves. And let's not forget the layered clothing strategy. Before heating coils and electric blankets, it was common for pioneers to start the day dressed like a fearsome cabbage. Layer upon layer, wool, linen, more wool. Children sometimes looked like walking, talking bundles of laundry, only with smaller boots. But when they scampered down into the root cellar to fetch more potatoes, it was those same layers that kept their brows unfrosted and their ears attached. Of course, not all settlers were fans of the underground lifestyle. There were always a few who preferred to tough it out above ground, sipping their tea stoically while the wind tried to rearrange their chimneys. These brave souls often developed complex relationships with their fireplaces, treating them like temperamental pets. "Come on, old friend," they'd mutter, coaxing the embers with patience. "Just one more blaze before the frost gets my toes." Meanwhile, their neighbors would be snug underground, reading by candlelight, listening to the soft sneeze of fermenting cabbages and fervently not missing the dramatic life upstairs. Interestingly, indigenous peoples had long been experts in using the ground to buffer temperature. Earth lodges on the Great Plains, dug partially below ground and topped with thatched roofs and layers of sod, maintained steady interior climates, warm in winter, cool in summer. Settlers borrowed heavily, sometimes unknowingly, from these time-tested methods, proving that intelligent design doesn't always require electricity or an instruction manual. And so it went. When the wind moaned like a ghost with unfinished business, the early settlers knew that a humble door in the floor might just be their coziest retreat. A low ceiling, a warm loaf of bread, and perhaps a jug or two of hard-earned applejack. With luck, even Buttons the cat would deem it acceptable. Because in a world where snow could erase your front porch overnight, the clever ones lived quietly, underground, surrounded not by luxury, but by layers of good judgment and preserved beats. Now, as the last lantern flickers and the cellar door creaks gently under the snow's weight, let's emerge slowly back into the world of blankets and stories, and step softly toward the next sheltering shadow on our wintry journey. As the snow thickened its quilt over the sleeping forests, and the wind rehearsed its howls across the chimneys of the budding colonies, a very particular kind of shelter quietly took root in the backwoods. The sunken, earthen half-house known simply as a dugout. Now, at first blush, a dugout may not sound like the grand architectural triumph of the early settler age. It was not, after all, adorned with Corinthian columns or buffalo hide chaise lounges. It had no steeples, no stained glass tributes to saints. It was, as the name suggests, literally dug out. Picture a hollowed nook, dug into the side of a hill, or straight down into the prairie sod. Part den, part hobbit-forward real estate. Mud walls, a roof patched with whatever could be scrounged, sod, animal skins, wooden planks, occasionally a row of disgruntled branches. It had the geological coziness of a badger's living room, and the warmth, surprisingly, of a well-burrowed idea. To the untrained 21st century eye, a dugout might resemble something left behind by an absent-minded mole. But to a 17th or 18th century settler, eking out an existence in the frostbitten nowhere, it was nothing short of an engineering marvel. For one, unlike the dainty above-ground homes with their noses high in the winter wind, the dugout hugged the thermal generosity of the earth. Soil, as it happens, makes a splendid blanket. Below the frost line, about 3 to 4 feet down, the temperature stayed remarkably stable, hovering somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Not balmy, no. But when the alternative was frost-nipped toes and the sound of your soup turning into a drumstick, 50 degrees felt like Tahiti. Some settlers, particularly those moving westward across the Great Plains during the 1800s, leaned heavily into this method. Sod houses were all well and good, and log cabins had their charms, mainly splinters and creaky nostalgia. But when there wasn't a tree in sight, and the buffalo didn't seem too keen to lend out their hides, the frontier spirit turned downward, quite literally. The classic dugout often began with a simple plan. Find a sloped hillside with forgiving dirt and no evidence of bare tenancy. Then carve into it. Reinforce with logs when available. If not, mud would do. Add a rudimentary chimney or hole in the ceiling for smoke to pretend it had an escape plan. Install a door, perhaps borrowed from a wagon, or fashioned from a collection of stubborn planks and rusted hinges. And voila, subterranean splendor. don't be fooled into thinking they were always cramped and dim. Some were surprisingly efficient. A good dugout could feature beds, shelves, and even small windows, which, granted, were often just openings covered in greased linen. But let's remember, the bar for natural lighting in winter was very low. One particular settler, a schoolteacher named Clarissa Hembley in what is now North Dakota, became local legend for hosting literary readings in her dugout during winter. Neighbors would trudge over in snowshoes, carrying stewed apples and bits of cured venison, squeezing shoulder to shoulder in her little rounded room, steam fogging up their spectacles. They'd listen by lamplight to tales of Odysseus or the latest scandalous letter from some British cousin with views on corset etiquette. No one seemed to mind that their feet were technically in dirt. It was warm, it was safe, it was human. Whispers of dugouts can still be found today. Little depressions in the landscape littered with foundations or tin kettles rusting under layers of leaf mold. Eco-friendly before it was fashionable, minimalism before it was monetized, and, let's be frank, the original bunker, minus the Cold War paperwork. And while they may not feature on glossy home design shows, unless Extreme Hill Homes ever gets picked up, dugouts serve as a reminder. Sometimes survival isn't about dominance. It's about blending in, listening to the land, and knowing when to get low, literally, until the storm passes. From the humble dugout, our story now drifts outward once again, to another lesser-known chapter of winter wizardry, one involving snow, sagas, and a certain reindeer-inspired architectural trick whispered through the boreal pines. If you ever find yourself trudging through thigh-deep snow in deer-hide boots, you stitched together with sinew and stubbornness, know that you're not alone. You're just about 6 generations too late. Our early settlers, those frost-kissed architects of hasty innovation, understood that winter wasn't merely a season. It was a siege. And to survive it, you didn't just need firewood. You needed cleverness, stubbornness, and, intriguingly, an intimate working knowledge of root cellars. Now, I know, root cellar doesn't exactly scream historical thrill ride, but you'd be surprised what drama can stem from a well-dug hole. Imagine a family in late 1700s New England. The last potato's been sliced with agonizing precision into something halfway between a meal and a prayer. Snow is heaped around their log cabin like an icy pudding, and the wind is having loud opinions about everything all night long. But beneath this frozen tableau, beneath the earth itself, lurks the unsung hero, the root cellar. These underground shelters, carved by hand with shovels and backaches, were more than food storage areas. In brutal weather, they became emergency bunkers. When a fire went out, when the roof leaked, or when the snow stopped being whimsical and started climbing in the windows, families sometimes slipped down into their root cellar for shelter. And why not? The temperature down there hovered somewhere between a fridge and a stern grandmother. Cold, but not deadly. Damp, but familiar. Cozy, in a peasant doomsday sort of way. Of course, not all cellars were created equal. Some were simple, dirt-dug closets, tucked into hillsides like hobbits, with a dark sense of realism. Others were stone-lined masterpieces, complete with ventilation shafts and dangerously slippery steps. Farmers with a flair for drama might decorate with dried onions hanging from the rafters. Candlelight refracted softly off rows of canned peaches, pickled beans, and something unidentifiable in a cloudy green jar that no one had the courage to taste since the year Aunt Miriam made it. In particularly harsh winters, these root cellars occasionally doubled as sleeping chambers. One would descend with blankets, lanterns, and a stern warning to the children. Don't knock over the vinegar jug again. Down there, surrounded by food that tasted like chores and desperation, families would huddle like raccoons in a museum exhibit. Think of it, your breath fogging against the stones, every creak overhead a mystery. Outside, the snow mounts higher. Coyotes yip in the black woods. But down here, among the carrots and cabbages, you're safe. Slightly pickled, yes, but alive. Most settlers, lacking thermometers or central heating, or much of anything really, relied on ingenuity and shared misery. Some even lit small fires outside their root cellars, allowing the smoke to drift in through a clever side vent. This mildly warmed the chamber, but also ensured everyone inside smelled like smoked ham by April. Ventilation was another thrilling frontier. Without proper airflow, moisture would build, and root rot would begin. And once the roots went, so did your chances of reaching spring without a diet consisting entirely of snow crusts and regret. So, meticulous settlers built adjustable vents, little wooden chutes or flaps, artfully jammed open with rocks, or, in some cases, old corn cobs serving noble second lives. In prairie regions, where wind had the manners of an unannounced auditor, settlers took shelter beneath the sod. Some built dugouts right into the banks of creeks or hillsides, cloaking the roof with layers of earth and grass. From the outside, they resembled mole houses built by people with poor blueprints and excellent motivation. But inside, surprisingly warm. The frozen wind howled above, but within these earthy burrito shells, temperatures remained comfortably survivable. Mice often dropped by uninvited, but you learn to negotiate. There's a moment in any long winter, usually right after the cup of pickled turnip tea, where a person questions their entire life. There, beneath the frost line, the settlers had time to reflect. Were they mad, brave, or just too cold to turn back? Whatever the answer, they endured. And they left behind more than just cellar blueprints and marmalade jars filled with secrets. Their whispered wisdom still lingers in the roots beneath our feet, where vegetables and stories sleep side by side, waiting for the thaw. And speaking of thawing, just ahead lies a curious chapter about how settlers didn't just survive the snow, but actually used it to their advantage, in ways that would make your local meteorologist raise one eternally frostbitten eyebrow. Sometimes, when the wind howls across a frozen landscape, it's not merely complaining, it's gossiping, whispering stories about the curious humans scuttling around below, doing terribly inventive things to avoid becoming human popsicles. Among its favorite tales is that of the settler who built a chimney beneath the snow. Now, before your imagination runs wild with upside-down fireplaces and soot-stained snowmen, let's drift slowly into the curious world of snow shelters, those unsung heroes of the harsh season that made the difference between perishing and persevering. The early settlers of North America, for all their enthusiasm and ill-timed optimism, quickly discovered that log cabins were not a one-size-fits-all miracle. As winters tumbled over the horizon like determined woolly mammoths, log cabins were only as warm as your firewood supply, and more than one enthusiast underestimated just how many trees would need to die so that a pioneer might live. Enter, quietly, and often unnoticed, the snow shelter. Now, we're not talking about igloos, which, while iconic and quite clever, had their architectural copyrights claimed by the Inuit up north. These were more rustic, improvised affairs, earthy, snowy, and occasionally drafty, but they worked. In fact, the snow itself became both enemy and ally. You see, snow, when packed just so, acts like an insulator. It's like an aggressive, freezing blanket that paradoxically keeps warmth in. Early woodsmen, trappers, and settlers, far from the comforts of even a semi-leaky cabin, began to dig down beneath the snow, creating what we might now call a quaint subnivean abode, but what they called whatever keeps Frank from losing his toes. Picture a trench dug wider than a man, but not by much, just enough space to lie down and not feel entirely like a sardine. Lining the bottom with boughs of evergreen, nature's very own skeletal mattress. They'd then roof the top with more branches, braced and overlapped, and pile snow atop that. The result? A low-slung cocoon that locked in body heat and muffled the sounds of the snarling weather above. Some made theirs with more flair. A few skilled woodsmen dug them into hillsides, essentially building snow bunkers with southern-facing entrances to catch the sun. These sunlight-chasing porches rarely worked as intended. The sun was often busy elsewhere, but it made the diggers feel clever, which is half the battle in winter. Inside, the shelters were, well, snug. One might describe the decor as frontier minimalism, with hints of pine and odor-damp wool. The ceiling, if you could call it that, was close enough to boop with your nose, and if you could sit up, your shelter was either very large or doing something wrong. Now, lighting a fire inside one of these was a fine line between coziness and carbon monoxide. Some attempted smoke funnels made of bark or snowblock chimneys, staking their hopes on the smoke behaving properly. A few clever individuals placed fires outside, in shallow pits at the mouth of the shelter, allowing the heat to waft in like a timid guest. The results varied, from delightfully warm to, well, at least the frostbite is symmetrical. Legend has it that one particularly clever fur trapper in the Yukon created a version of this shelter with separated compartments, one for sleeping, one for gear, and one designated as the pantry, which consisted of a small hollow stuffed with smoked meat and an increasingly confused-looking rabbit. Of course, urban settlers, who still clung to their stoves and indoor voices, rarely resolved to root around in the snow like Arctic foxes. But out in the true wilderness, the snow shelter was a quiet marvel. No blueprints, no mortgages, and no neighbors asking whether they could borrow your kindling again. And as much as we like to imagine these pioneers as rugged, bearded paragons of resilience, the reality is that sitting in a shallow snow hole with icicles on your eyebrows is a humbling, even meditative experience. You listen to the world go quiet above, the snow filtering sound like a thick dream. Your breath fogs the tiny space. Your fingers cradle your last biscuit, and you muse quietly over how civilization might really be overrated if it doesn't come with a better solution for frozen socks. Though quaint and short-lived, these shelters taught generations that adaptation didn't always have to arrive with fanfare. Sometimes survival was just about getting very still and very low to the ground. As the stars blinked above the snow, unseen by the person dozing beneath it, the secrets of the winter world deepened, and soon our gentle trail winds toward a curious invention that promised to bring warmth to even the frostiest of feet without setting the snow on fire. By the time the deep heart of winter arrived and snow settled like a thick woolen blanket over the land, early settlers had long since disappeared underground, or close enough. They weren't burrowing like badgers exactly, but their winter accommodations had more in common with root cellars than with your typical gingerbread cottage fantasies. Let's drift together now into the snowy stillness of the Great Plains, sometime in the early 1800s, where the wind whistles like a nosy ghost, and settlers peer out from barely visible openings in the earth. Windows, if you can call them that, which in more cases than not, were actually greasy paper or stretched animal bladder pinned over holes in the dirt walls. These were sod houses, or soddies, as their sneeze-inducing interiors were affectionately called. Built from prairie turf hacked up into bricks with spades and stacked high like questionable brownies, sod houses were a desperate but brilliant solution when forests were fewer than neighbours. A gentle ox plough, used slyly, could carve thick ribbons of grassy earth, which were then cut to length and hoisted into square-ish chunks. Each one was heavier than a poorly written poem, and twice as hard to hold. They came complete with embedded beetles, unexpected toads, and all manner of root stubble. But none of that mattered when the wind outside could skin a shrub, and the temperature insisted on staying somewhere within troll cave levels. Once built, the sod house created a kind of earthen cave with uncanny insulation. The thick walls could cradle in warmth from a cooking fire and, crucially, muffled the sound of the ceaseless wind. Talk about soundproofing. Prairie children could shout Shakespearean monologues, and the bison herd outside wouldn't hear a lick. Of course, cozy is not quite the right term. Romantic canvas paintings did settlers no favours. Inside, these homes were dark and rather porous. A solid gust could make little rivers trickle down the inside walls, and regular sweeping was a must, since dirt often fell from the ceiling with more confidence than you'd hope. There are diary entries from homesteading mothers who describe cooking soup and realizing later that half the flavor came from sediment. If you've ever wanted a soup with notes of thyme, turnip, and roof, the soddy kitchen would be your dream bistro. Now, should one stumble upon a fortunate grove or deadfall, the log cabin was the jewel of the survival crown. But unless you carved the logs for a living or happened to be Paul Bunyan's cousin, log homes required more labor and carpentry skill than most had to spare. So those in timber-rich areas worked together before winter set in, raising cabins like some kind of frontier barn-raising party, involving neighbors, laughter, and a shocking number of minor concussions. Each hand-hewn log was notched just so, fitted without nails in a tight embrace worthy of a romantic subplot. And the fireplaces. A good chimney was less a luxury, and more a full-time job to keep from catching a light. Stones were stacked and mortared with mud, smoke curled upward, and if luck smiled, the fire didn't backdraft into the room and smudge everyone's eyebrows. But the true five-star survival suite, the dugout, a literal hole carved into a hillside, often with a log or sod front, and everything else underground. The main benefit: thermal stability. Like a wise old badger's den, the earth kept things warmer than above-ground cabins. And crucially, it was cheaper. The downsides? Let's just say if you've never tried pan-frying cornbread 3 feet from your sleeping spot while noticing a snake in the rafters, you haven't lived frontier luxury. Dugouts were often dim, cramped, and came with unwelcome visits from moles, spiders, and that one very disappointed raccoon who thought it was moving into a human-free cave. Still, despite their quirks, these humble homes did what grand mansions could not. They kept their people warm. With little more than mud, grass, smoke, determination, and the occasional startled rodent, families pressed through winters so cruel they could curdle milk from a frown. And as snow piled high and winds howled like forgotten flutes outside, settlers told stories by the fire, patched socks, stirred thick stews, and waited for thaw, for spring, and for the blessing of a blue sky that finally smiled wide enough to melt the edges of the world. But staying warm was only half the battle. Staying fed, that required stranger ingenuity still. As winter's breath grew colder and the evenings darker than a pioneer's sense of humor after a failed potato harvest, settlers across the North American frontier began enacting a tradition as old as hardship itself. The midwinter shuffle. This wasn't a type of desperate dance move, though toes near frostbite might qualify, but rather the careful repositioning of entire lives into what they called snow homes, sometimes just politely referred to as dugouts, and occasionally less politely as holes with a roof and wishful thinking. Now, don't let the name fool you. A dugout wasn't a hastily carved hidey hole, though it certainly started as one. With improving techniques, some of these subterranean sanctuaries evolved into half-earth castles, insulated by nature's own thick blanket of soil, timber, and the eternal optimism of people who thought, well, it's warmer down here than it is up there, probably. A classic winter dugout required a gentle slope, a sturdy back wall carved into a hill, and enough patience to argue with frozen ground by candlelight. The roof, typically made of logs or thick branches, would be covered in sod and snow, prime real estate for unintended raccoon guests. The front entrance, usually a patchwork door of wooden planks and moral resolve, offset just enough to prevent the wind from marching in and making itself a third roommate. Life inside wasn't exactly glamorous. The bed might be a straw mattress laid over a wooden plank, which creaked mournfully every time someone sighed dramatically. Heat came from a tiny, smoky fireplace, more ambition than function. And light, perhaps one flickering tallow candle, casting long theatrical shadows across the walls, as if the room were putting on some very slow interpretive shadow puppet play. But clever settlers, as ever, found ways to make this earthen life not just bearable, but oddly cozy. They would line the walls with anything: old newspapers, scraps of leather, even bark. Yes, bark, because nothing says home sweet home like staring into the poetic grain of a pine tree's skin. It helped insulate, and also gave children something to read when they got bored of the wind howling like a homesick wolf. Cooking was done over small hearths, or on iron stoves barely convinced to kindle in sub-zero temperatures. Meals were simple affairs. Stews back then were less culinary expressions and more whatever hasn't frozen solid yet. Root vegetables such as parsnips and turnips became winter royalty, and anyone ungrateful for the umpteenth potato and lard concoction was quietly assigned dishwashing, which, inconveniently, meant carrying ice-cold buckets of snow indoors to melt. A well-built dugout might stand its ground for multiple seasons. Settlers proudly passed down the secrets: the angle of the slope, the sacred art of not chopping logs too thin, and the deeply held belief that a dry floor was the eighth wonder of the world. Some even developed camouflage techniques, covering the entire roof with extra snow to avoid detection, whether from wolves, passing enemy raiders, or very determined in-laws. Community-wise, there was something about surviving chest-deep snow in shared sentences that pulled people together. Many a story was swapped over mugs of heated whatever they had, beside fires that behaved more like sulking teenagers than reliable flames. Marriages were proposed, babies were born, and arguments were had over who got the side of the dugout with less mystery moisture. Still, it wasn't just the architecture that helped settlers endure the frigid grip of winter. It was the attitude, a quiet stubbornness, the sort of resolve that came from knowing nobody was going to carry you through the cold but your own blistered hands, and the hope tucked inside your wool shirt. Each night, as frost feathered the windows and icicles gave gravity a reason to be festive, families in their half-underground fortresses would pull up animal skin blankets, listen to the soft lullaby of wind curling past the stone entrance, and remember why they'd come here in the first place. Not for comfort, but for a future worth freezing for. Over time, some buried shelters vanished, collapsed by snow, forgotten in the budding rush of spring, but others waited under layers of earth and leaf litter, like secret echoes of human grit. And occasionally, in the quietest woods, where snow muffles even your footsteps, someone stumbles upon the outline of a sunken roof, a bit of old wood, and the faintest trace of warmth left behind. And speaking of warmth, as spring begins to blink awake across the frostbitten frontier, our next little stop reveals how these frosty survivors took a rather imaginative turn with underground insulation tricks, and just why some settlers hoarded moss like green gold, while the fierce winds outside howled like a choir of disgruntled wolves in therapy. The early settlers of frigid northern climes were quietly, sometimes literally, underground, bending the rules of survival with ingenuity as their compass and snow as their blanket. Among the more charmingly peculiar solutions devised to fend off death by Jack Frost was something called the sod home. Picture a house made of earth, but before you scoff, think of it not as mud, but as edible insulation, minus the edibility, of course. Prairie settlers, especially in the Great Plains of the 1800s, were surrounded by an astonishing lack of trees and a surplus of dirt and stubborn optimism. So they did what humans do best when Mother Nature slams the door. They tunneled through the floor. Sod houses were, in essence, structured stacks of grass-woven soil bricks, blocks of prairie turf sliced with a homemade spade into loaves that looked suspiciously like vegan meatloaf. Laid atop one another with hypnotic precision, these walls were dense, heavy, and surprisingly good at keeping the warmth in, and the wolves, both literal and metaphorical, out. And while they weren't much to look at, imagine an especially tired hobbit starter home. They were warm, but warmth alone doesn't make a shelter secret. What makes these sod homes quietly thrilling in hindsight was their vanishing act. Come winter, buried in snowdrifts or blanketed in frost, these homes practically disappeared. From a distance, most looked like small hills or lumpy mistakes in the landscape. If you didn't know someone was living there, you'd walk right past, possibly into an elk. And that, my drowsy listener, was entirely the point. The secret shelter wasn't always beneath a snow hill or buried in sod. In regions of New England and New France, homesteaders employed a little something that sounds like it was named by a tired farmer with a poetic streak: dugouts. Carefully etched into riverbanks or hillside burrows, they were part cave, part cabin, part I can't believe we live in this. Dugouts spared early settlers from battling the outside elements by, well, hardly going outside. With earthen walls to stabilize temperature and often just one entrance, which they cleverly cover with felled logs and packed moss, these homes balanced warmth with stealth. A strategically placed stovepipe popping out of the snow like a lost periscope might be the only clue that someone was sipping warm broth just beneath your feet. Now, while our modern sensibilities might recoil at the idea of living in a place where the roof occasionally sprouts mushrooms, or where your neighbor is officially a mole, these formats worked brilliantly. But the brilliance didn't stop at structures. Settlers mastered social geometry as well. When snow isolated the homestead, and food supplies dwindled to little more than dried beans and boot leather soup, Not recommended. Families employed something called visiting rotation. A neighbor would trudge over with the pretense of checking on your cow, but in reality, it was code for, "I brought a fiddle, and please tell me you still have pickles." These visits were short, brisk affairs, only a few hours, or until someone's beard froze to the window latch. But they were enough. Enough to share a jar of something brined or fermented or charred, or sometimes all three, and swap tales that grew increasingly resistant to the truth with every retelling. Speaking of tales and coats of pleasant exaggeration, many settlers passed the long winter months reviving stories from the old countries. Norwegian immigrants, for instance, told tales about the Nisa, a mischievous little house spirit who was said to protect the home if kept happy with porridges and no sudden loud changes in emotional temperature. Frankly, a little like a house cat, but with a better sense of duty. This whimsical creature served two very practical purposes. One, it gave children something fun to believe in that wasn't frostbite. And two, it encouraged tidiness and generosity, because apparently, even centuries ago, people needed a mythological creature to motivate them to do the dishes. And so, beneath the snow-glazed surface of the sleeping world, inside moss-capped hillsides or burrowed banks of ice, people survived. Quietly, carefully, cleverly, with their sod walls, shared stews, fiddle music, and the occasional folkloric house hymn to keep things spicy. These settlers had all they needed: warmth, wit, and the enduring hope that spring, eventually, would stop being coy and show up. And just ahead, there's a final flicker in the hearthlight. Let's follow it now, into that next soft breath of history, barely glowing on the horizon. Snow had long since settled into every crease of the forest, like powdered sugar dusted over the curls of a very large, very cold cake. In the distance, chimneys whispered thin spirals of smoke upward, weaving their way into the pewter sky. Winter wasn't knocking anymore. It had moved in, taken off its boots, and started reorganizing the spice rack. And yet, in the heart of this frostbitten world, beneath the branches of stoic pines and down trails hidden in silence, something almost mischievous stirred, a quiet defiance in the form of heat, cleverness, and tea. Yes, as it turns out, the early settlers didn't just survive the winter, they outwitted it. At the core of their secret arsenal, the earth itself. Across the colonial frontier, settlers hunched against the wind learned to play a seasonal game of hide and seek. Only instead of hiding from children, they were evading the gaping mouth of death by frostbite. The cleverest among them dug winter cellars and semi-subterranean shelters known variously as pit houses, dugouts, and, if you were overly romantic, cozy holes of seasonal stubbornness. These earthen dwellings were often carved into hillsides or sunken into level ground, roofed with whatever combination of logs, sod, bark, and bravado that could be summoned. Inside, temperatures stabilized around 50-ish degrees Fahrenheit, positively tropical by 1700s wilderness standards. With a stone hearth, a low ceiling for heat conservation, and a door more stubborn than a mule in January, these hideaways became winter bunkers of the highest order. Not everyone was delighted by the idea, of course. More than one visiting Brit visitor, wearing 3 hats and still sneezing, recorded such shelters as ghastly holes best left to marmots and other unshaven creatures. Local settlers, meanwhile, shrugged, stirred their stew, and added another layer of moss to the walls. Insulation is insulation. Then came the real masterpiece, what historians might quietly call a multimodal thermal strategy. and what you and I might describe as everything warm, everywhere, all at once. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were nestled under sleeping mats. Tidy pots of thick stew doubled as hand warmers. A gamey-smelling squirrel pelt made an impromptu scarf, and the family dog, if you had one, shifted overnight from working animal to very enthusiastic hot water bottle. And yes, the dogs. Picture this: a collie curled up next to a whittled pine bunk, snowflakes painting the windows white like frost-whipped cream, and someone murmuring a fireside story about the time old Nate's dugout collapsed because he stored turnips in the ceiling. They were enormous turnips, truly reckless produce. For entertainment, some settlers carved chess pieces out of bone. Others sang so softly into the fireplace, you'd think they were trying not to wake the smoke. A few wrote letters, mostly about the chill, mostly illegible from mitten handwriting. By lantern light and stewed memory, they survived, not by battling the winter, but by becoming its quiet, clever companion. We can't forget the snowshoe paths either, winding out from these hidden homes like secret roads of determination. They connected shelter to shelter, neighbor to neighbor, life to lifeline. Stories traveled those paths too. So did extra bread, tanned hides, and the occasional borrowed frying pan that mysteriously never returned. Culinary theft, the least talked about frontier crime. What's more remarkable than all of this is how little fuss early settlers made about it. In diaries and ledgers, January might merit 2 lines at best: very cold, dog lost under blanket again. And yet, under those sentences was 1,000 tiny decisions that added up to survival, that quietly etch persistence into the history of winter. So tonight, as the stars peer down like tiny frozen lanterns and your pillow finds just the right tilt, think of those quiet shelters. Think of how warmth can be made, not just found. How a dugout with mossy walls and a stubborn door can become, quite honestly, the coziest cave on earth. And maybe, just maybe, that secret squirrel pelt scarf wasn't such a bad idea after all. Good night, my curious friend. Let the snow fall where it may. You've already built your shelter, right here between history and dreams.